Well, it's funny, as I was walking here, I was wondering something really important, no? That I think is in common with, we have in common that none of us know what I'm going to say. And I think that's the starting point, in a way, because when we obviously don't have knowledge, we look for it. And when we don't have it, we despair and we fix it with our doubts. So skepticism is a fascinating topic. And, we know that it's this continued re-examination of, previous knowledge claims that has characterized the history of philosophy. And to be honest, I think that the history of philosophy can be seen in part as a struggle with skepticism. And these past few years, which brought me to this topic, basically, it can feel as if entire countries have been given over to a vast psychological experiment on two truths and one lie. And, how can one make sense of Russian actions, for example, as opposed to Ukrainian actions in a disorienting moral context such as war? What genealogical system of reference do we use? Do we go for the historical, Western or Eastern? Do we go for ideological, the individual? Do we go for the social, so like the individual representations of the culture? And if we think about the principle of sufficient reason, that is this powerful, controversial philosophical principle whereby everything must have a reason, must have a cause, must have a ground, then critics have contended that skepticism is self-refuting. That is, both logically and humanly, you cannot formulate, anything because it builds upon something, some knowledge claims that about what is supposed to be dubious. And is it going forward? Oh, sorry. No problem. I will, while we prepare the next slide, which is just basically a summary of what I'm going to break down, these opposites. And then I'm going to end up just understand a little bit the concept of belief and how it relates to skeptical belief. And then this new sort of paradigm, which is part of a, which is part of a broader theory of knowledge that I'm working on. So this is just the beginning. And so let's think about the vast increase in data creation and the vast increase on knowledge dissemination. And that result from the 20th century, innovation of ITs that transformed our knowledge society, I would say, into an information society. That means that we used to create and disseminate knowledge, and now we do the same. So we use the information, but just to take effective action. So it's actually purposeful, and it can be positive or negative. And indeed, it can be beneficial on several levels. If we think about democratizing education, so universal access to education, but also knowledge has become public good. That means that also expert knowledge can be done by anyone. Indeed, there are major problems, epistemological problems, such as filtering and data accuracy. And we, in a way, saw the coronavirus-related disinformation that permeated, in a way, social media and disappeared in favor of more recent geopolitical events like the Ukrainian war. And then we can see with cybernetics, in a way, that the foundational unities and the canonical certainties can be put into discussion. And in a way, if we want to put that into extreme, we want to put that into extreme, then we can see that I think, like Baudrillard did in The Cold War did not happen in 1991, media shape the reality. And whatever we know about society, or indeed about the world in which we live, we know through the mass media. This is true not only for our knowledge of society, but more broadly, also for our knowledge of nature. We all know this, right? This is the springboard that postmodernism uses. And it's, sort of like the school of thought that says there are no truths, all interpretations. And they establish a scholarly tradition in many fields that address these social concerns. So in a way, there is an inevitable fusion of truth with social power. But at the same time, what we understand, which is important for me, is that with these logical or historical genealogical references that I'm making, we can see that there is a pragmatic subordination of information to practical action, and foundationalism is in a way to be dismissed because we need to think about this contingent nature of human actions especially in this process. So the power is so important because it's the ability to influence people and events, namely epistemic ones as well. And now, if before was just related to diffuse means, so propaganda, the institutions, nowadays it is prominently major individual agency. So in a way, you have one digital actor against others, and again, plays a central role in knowledge making. So some people call it cyber literacy of power, because it was concerned with forces that shape knowledge production, the construction and transmission of meaning, being more about engaging the knowledge than mastering the information, which is what we try to do, especially philosophers. Now, what I'm trying to achieve with all these references, first of all, obviously, this is the background of what I'm going to say later. But there's another aspect, which is the opposite. So philosophers in this post-truth era have sharply disagreed, especially they distinguish knowledge and certainty, and they argue about it because they say we can, in a way, achieve certainty. That is a state of being free from doubt. And believing is possible without warrant, without evidence, but certainty implies having valid evidence of proof. So what happened? That at some point, algorithms came in a way to rescue us and make us believe in practically possible certainty. And, you know, we had Euclid's algorithm. Now we have algorithms that are going to fact check. And as a result, expert knowledge is no longer exclusive to certain individual. A typical example that I recall from my professional context would be, for example, predict the chance that someone convicted of a crime will reoffend, drawing on data about their characteristics and those of previous crime. But the algorithm turns out to overpredict reoffending by blacks relative to whites. And again, we can see that fact correlation does not imply fact causation. We can see that some variables in these algorithms, very technical, are omitted, or because models are purposely overfitted by the creators. And again, we're back to square one, which is that individual moral choices are made in the design. And yes, practitioners can use models. We can say that they're a useful way of clarifying our assumptions and deriving their implications for our use, but not a guaranteed truth, path to truth. And in a way, this makes a compelling case. And that's why skepticism, we see it in the news, we saw it with COVID. And I think at the moment, we are in the age of doubt, because continuous quest for certainty means infinitism about justification, which in turn follows that the concept of knowledge is elusive. And again, we're back to refusing foundationalism in a way. And even with the most intelligent technology, we can say that basic beliefs are always dependent on one's will, which is discretionary. Now, the main difference between fact and truth is that fact is something that exists in real form. So someone can say, yeah, but rational agents are able to reason. We are not credulous, right? And they are able to think their way to a solution. But especially in our times, and this comes mostly from cognitive scientists and social scientists, the information society, and that's why I distinguished it from the knowledge one, made us learn how easy it is to reify a belief or reify its non-existence, which means that sometimes the vaunted human capacity for reason may have more to do with winning arguments than with thinking straight. And in that sense, even after the evidence for our beliefs has been totally refuted, we fail to make appropriate revisions in those beliefs, the researchers noted. Particularly, reason is unanimously considered now an adaptation to the hypersocial niche that humans have evolved throughout the history. And we believe, because of especially cognitive scientists and neuroscientists, that sociability is the key to how the human mind functions, or perhaps more pertinently, I would say, malfunctions. And so in this sense, one implication of this sort of confusion is that there's no sharp boundary between one person's ideas and knowledge and those of the members of the group. And this is very important. Although the other flip of the coin is that when it comes to new technologies, incomplete understanding is empowering, because obviously it allows you to pursue a new world of possibilities in the uncertainty. So what I'm trying to say is that providing people with information, accurate information, doesn't seem to help, because they simply discount it. And so where do we go from here? So we think about, we were dissatisfied with modernism certainty. So we embraced postmodernism, and it was exasperated by the information society. But then at some point, I think now, and we saw it quite a lot, especially in the social analysis, we are exhausted by postmodernism's skepticism. And so what shall we embrace? We shall embrace, I think, a viewing of the world that emphasizes a kind of integrated pluralism at the intersection, which means that, whose paradigmatic form is a skepticism that is considered intuitive rather than natural, that does not hinge on epistemological realism as contended. And in a way, because of this, we can see that even war itself, for example, has an ethics surprisingly based on principles that are completely different from other moral, or I would say spiritual beliefs, because it's going to be the basic deontological premise of their own ethics. So in that sense, we can understand that there are opportunities, like, for example, skeptical beliefs that confirm that in this society, it looks like evidence as a condition of objectivity, which, if systematic consistency is legally considered, but in general considered as truth, becomes conditional upon the actors rather than the action. And also, to be admissible, the evidence must always be relevant to the subject. And it is. That's the case, because it makes a fact more or less probable, so the probable cause, than it would be without it. But the human relevance, or the connection, I would say, implies that evidence concocts with personal interests, or let's call it situational risk. So practical interests are important in this sense, because then the weight of the evidence is based on the believability or the persuasiveness of evidence rather than its certainty. Because, as we saw before, it's elusive, even if we apply it to artificial intelligence, which is what they're trying to do. So reliability is a discretionary justification. And we can see that truth is absolute truth only to the extent that our beliefs allow it to be absolutely true. Consequently, one shall not completely dismiss a skeptical belief, because, as we saw, first of all, it's not self-refuting. And for me, there's a reason why that comes from this analysis of fact and information and beliefs in postmodern world, which is, we can postulate a skeptical belief about P's existence or non-existence. We can claim that P does not exist, so partial or total lack of knowledge, relying on a different system. And in that way, our skeptical arguments are not self-contradictory, as if knowledge of non-knowledge, right? But they simply qualify as an appeal to ignorance. So in a way, it's just a claim, it's an assertion, a plausible assumption of evidence of absence, which, is based on arbitrary foundationalism. And just to clarify a little bit more what I mean by that, I wanted to draw a distinction between what is a non-inferential language. That is, I think, flies in the face of a subtle misconception also about skepticism, whereby skeptical philosophizing goes on in theory while believing goes on in practice. I do not draw this distinction. As we saw, truth is the state of being the fact, that is the condition, the circumstances that shape, the shape that knowledge takes at a specific time and place. Therefore, there is a manipulative and malleable, I would say, nature of truth that rules out, as we saw, a rational, or I would say a practical method of truth analysis. But at the same time, an assertion is something you claim to be true, and then an axiom is a statement that everyone agrees to accept as true. So again, very pragmatic, in order, obviously, to see what consequences ensue, because we are, as I said, social animals. So we need to get ahead with our lives, which is understandable. But what does that mean? Is that skepticism is intuitive and not natural anymore. And as I said, does not hinge on epistemological realism as contended, but simply, you know, it does not hinge on epistemological realism for its critical assessments of reality, but basically it's just asserting contentions and possibly dispensable theoretical preconceptions, which is fine, because that's something that you cannot, in a way, deceive with rhetoric, with logic. And we saw that the reason why I draw, I would say, expertise from cognitive scientists is because they are the latest who confirm that facts don't change our minds. And we saw that, which I think it's good to refer to have like a clear picture. With COVID, we saw that with the war. That's beyond propaganda. It's more about individual agency that in a moment of belief is actually more powerful than the fact sometimes. So it's not that easy just to dismiss skepticism as self-refuting, because now when we put it under theoretical preconceptions, it goes out completely of the epistemological discourse and it becomes just something that is a belief. And you need a belief before knowledge, it's subjective requirement for knowledge. Then knowledge, we saw in the information society, is in a way pragmatically with consilience created. And that brings me to, obviously, the reason why I started is because before we approach a theory of knowledge, we need to approach a theory of understanding. When we think about theory of understanding, skepticism plays an important role. And I think that the bottom line is that we are anchored to a scientific empirical epistemology that is inadequate for a host of reasons. And the most obvious is that it completely fails to solve the problem of skepticism, which is why before approaching a theory of knowledge or a theory of understanding, I wanted to sort of clarify. And in that sense, scientific approach has its limits. Over-reliance on rational analysis of truth tends to narrow epistemological, I would say, options, and as well shut down innovation, although it can be good for technology and other fields. And that's because it's designed to understand natural phenomena that cannot be changed. And the way they approached skepticism in their criticism is naturally in that way. And I think it's not an effective way to evaluate that. And also it's, I guess, except Timothy Williamson, who lately, I think in 2008 with Knowledge and Its Limits, positive that knowledge is actually a sui generis concept. We don't even have to worry about creating a theory. But except him, we were stuck for many, many years with, obviously, skepticism because it's in the way of our theory of knowledge. And that's why I, in a way, classified three approaches. It's a three-tiered approach that I think you can use to articulate objection. And this is quite different. It's closely related to Pierre Le Morvan, that was the first one in 2011 who wanted to bypass skepticism. That is not dismissed it, which is not what I'm doing today. I'm bringing two different perspectives. I'm open to have, your views on that. But at the same time, I include it as I accept it. And I don't want to overcome it as we would like to do sometimes. I want to acknowledge it, which is a term that I'm using on purpose, because then it's going to be building up the theory of knowledge, a new unified theory of knowledge between, scientific and humanistic, which is what we need and what is the big, I would say, demarcation line at the moment. And so this is a sort of meta-psychology, I would say, of the 21st century. And it's a very unified synthetic approach. So probable, we resolve it with consilience. In the probable, skepticism is something that is very common. It's the most healthy form, it's the most ordinary. So ethics, we have, I would say, highly opinionated topics as well in terms of aesthetics. We have instrumental pragmatism. We solve this sciences and, I guess, epistemology. So that means that we more or less shadow the instrumentalism, the theory in history of sciences and social sciences, whereby we are not giving you the truth with our experiments or everything. It's just useful for the time being. And then the time, or I guess it's instrumental for the time being, then it can be reverted or completely changes. And then the latest that I call about to agnosticism is a sort of negligible. So things like God, life, I would say truth that I was talking about today, deconstructing it, it's negligible in a way because it's a vicious form of skepticism. And in that way, we need to reach, I would say, we do in religion, a sort of agnosticism where we need to, on these topics, we just need to simply not say anything. So,
epoche.
Thank you.